I'm Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Thursday, October 17th. Today is day 377. Um, so a weekly summary. I'll try to start with the news that's the most recent, but news from just last night. Politico issued an exclusive report. This was about 6 p.m. East Coast time, that Biden's envoy told aid groups that Israel was too close of an ally to the United States to be able to suspend arms. What's interesting is that the news about this just broke last night, but it was about a meeting that happened in August. So attendees attended a meeting in late August with a Biden senior official. Her name's Elise Grande. They said her remarks were surprisingly candid, shocking many in the room. Politico exclusively reported that this top U.S. official who was working on the humanitarian situation in Gaza told aid groups in August that the U.S. would not consider withholding weapons from Israel for blocking food and medicine from entering the enclave, which was a rare admission for someone in the administration. The meeting happened on August 29th. There were more than a dozen aid organizations in the room. And so the whole conversation was about the U.S. applying pressure through the United Nations and what alternatives there were, because the U.S. would not be willing to put a hold or a delay or stop weapons shipment. Why is this significant? This is significant because just this last weekend, and I'll talk more about this, the U.S. Told Israel that they might put a hold on weapons unless aid got into North Gaza. And so the question is, if what happened in August is true, it makes this current claim about withholding weapons a lot less credible. And so that was the whole point of this Politico argument. And one of the whole questions has been, this statement that just happened, this letter that came from the U.S. to Israel this weekend, saying that aid had to be allowed into North Gaza. The letter put a 30-day requirement on it. Aid had to be allowed into Gaza within 30 days. And one of the questions that's being asked is, why 30 days? And so the State Department spokesperson, Matthew Miller, responded and said, because it's appropriate that we give Israel a chance and an opportunity to respond to the problem. So all of that's kind of the most recent news from late last night that I wanted to be sure to let you know about. The rest of my updates are all from yesterday or before. So some of the most significant news over the past few days, over Yom Kippur weekend, the Pentagon announced that the White House had approved the deployment of what's called THAAD, a THAAD battery. THAAD stands for the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Battery. Not only did the U.S. send this battery, we also sent U.S. military personnel to Israel, which has a whole nother set of implications. Not only is the U.S. sending arms, but now we're actually sending U.S. Military employees. And this was, according to the U.S., in response to Iran's unprecedented attacks, the attacks on April 13th and October 1st. There's a question about whether or not this is a violation of the War Powers Act, sending U.S. troops into armed conflict without the consent of Congress. I want to go into some specific updates related to Gaza. Yesterday, I and a few of the CMEP board organizations met with a couple of members of the Harris campaign. We also have requested a meeting with the Trump campaign. One of our main talking points was the inconsistency of the Biden administration, the way it's contradicting itself, calling for negotiations, de-escalation, diplomatic solutions on one hand, sending weapons and arms on the other. And the people we met with were sure to highlight this letter. I think it was sent Sunday or Monday, this letter from the Biden administration to Israeli leaders demanding that Israel take steps within 30 days to improve humanitarian conditions in Gaza by allowing in more aid. On Tuesday, news all over the world was reporting this and about how the U.S. has intensified pressure. But one of the questions is, if vaccines can be let in, we're now in phase 2 of the polio vaccination process, and that process was so successful. It said that 600,000 polio vaccines were, over the course of a few weeks, administered. If that was able to be so successfully applied, why is water and food and humanitarian assistance such an issue? It just seems so inconsistent. Now, since that letter has been sent, 50 trucks have been allowed into North Gaza. So that happened just yesterday, Wednesday. The Israeli government decided to allow 50 trucks into North Gaza. That aid came from Jordan. It included food, water, medical equipment, and shelter equipment. We do know that aid deliveries have dropped more than 50%. Since Israel provided assurances in both March and April to the United States that they would increase aid. And so one of the concerns is that, Israel will make promises, and then what ends up happening is not only do they not fulfill the promises, but the opposite happens. I would call your attention to, I don't know if you've seen, but CMEP is a part of a group of aid and development agencies. We are not a development agency, but we partner with a number that have active work in Gaza. On October 9th, our latest humanitarian snapshot came out, and we can put that in the chat. I'll do that later if Nicole doesn't do it right now. But we have the 6th humanitarian snapshot that has the latest facts and statistics about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. As of yesterday, the death toll in Gaza was at least 42,409 people killed, and those wounded is just under 100,000. All the while, it was announced that the Likud party, which is Netanyahu's party, circled an invitation. They're going to be having an event right alongside the Gaza border that's entitled Preparing to Settle Gaza. The event is scheduled for next week. And so they're talking about what it might look like for settlements to be reestablished in North Gaza. That's what that event is about. On Tuesday of this past week, UN officials accused Israel of atrocities after tents and other shelters were caught on fire. This happened after an Israeli airstrike on a hospital compound. There were horrific videos where a person was burned alive that erupted in international media. Honestly, didn't pay nearly enough attention. And that was one of the atrocities that was reported in the news this week. A U.S. National Security Council spokesperson at the White House said they made their concerns known to the Israeli government about that attack, which killed 4 people. And when you look at the rhetoric that's used, we made our concerns known when things like that and atrocities like that are committed. I don't know what to say other than that's just not good enough. But also on Tuesday, Israeli airstrikes killed 40 Palestinians across Gaza as Israeli forces closed in on Jabalia. One of the things that was discussed over the past several weeks is the idea that because Israel was paying more attention to Lebanon, that escalations and attacks in Gaza would decrease, and that has just not been the case. Not only have things become so much worse in North Gaza, but the death toll, the attacks, the bombings, and things in Gaza have just continued. Evacuations in Gaza in the north have been a huge issue. There were these evacuations that were issued, then the area was declared a military zone. I've been a part of some private briefings where the situation was described as beyond horrific. Aid organizations were warning of the humanitarian disaster before these evacuation orders, prior to this most recent shipment of 50 trucks, which will just save starvation. That is all that will do. The population there had no food shipments for at least 2 weeks since the beginning of the month. I've not spent a lot of time addressing this, but the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant told Secretary of Defense Austin over the weekend that the IDF was not carrying out a starvation plan. There actually is a written plan, and I've seen this in Hebrew. It was reported by the Associated Press. They're calling this the General's Plan, and it is a starvation plan. Netanyahu has said there's an argument about whether or not he's employing it, but it's an idea of starving out Hamas. And so the General's Plan is this idea of intentional starvation. And of course, you know, Secretary Blinken denied U.S. aid's reports about whether or not aid was being used as an intentional weapon of war. There are actual written plans in Hebrew that show that it has been codified, you know, that it has actually been written into military, intentionality is my point. Vice President Harris said over the weekend that no food had entered Gaza. She was talking about how Israel must urgently do more to facilitate the flow of aid. And so, of course, the Harris team has been really highlighting about how her rhetoric has been strong. And our argument's been that's just rhetoric, right? And so it's yet to be seen whether or not, the U.S. would actually enforce any of the things that they're saying. On Monday, there were reports in Gaza that 4 people were killed and 50 wounded when there was an airstrike at Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital. That was the hospital that was attacked, where the tents were caught on fire. Medical sources in the Strip said that 10 people were killed and 30 were wounded, including women and children, in an airstrike that was on the Jabalia refugee camp. There was another school that was struck where 15 people were killed over the weekend. I mentioned the polio vaccination campaign that had begun. In Israel, the Supreme Court was responding to the question about why there are so few medical evacuations. There also has been a conversation in Israel that Israel is starting to experience a severe shortage of interceptor missiles, where former military officials and analysts have been talking to the Financial Times about this. Israel's air defenses will be stretched, but not only that, one of the conversations is that the U.S. military can't keep this up. The U.S. has been supplying Ukraine and Israel, and that the U.S. military will soon be reaching a tipping point. There was another major incident in Israel on Tuesday. A police officer was killed and 4 civilians were wounded in a shooting attack in South Israel on Tuesday. And Defense Minister Gallant also had a meeting with hostages' families, saying that Hamas is hardening its stance in negotiations for a hostage deal, and that they're likely waiting for developments in the fighting with Iran and Hezbollah, adding that the organization does not want to make progress because they have nothing to lose. The UK government announced that they are placing sanctions on settler groups connected to illegal construction in the West Bank and sponsoring violence against communities in the West Bank. They said that the measures were putting strict financial restrictions on those who are committing such acts. The IDF also said that they killed an Islamic Jihad operative south of Jenin over the past week as well. In the West Bank, a 20-year-old was shot and killed in an operation in Jenin, and a 17-year-old Palestinian was killed in Jenin as well over the weekend. Moving on to escalations between Israel and Hezbollah. Israeli forces struck South Beirut for the first time in several days. 16 people were killed and 43 were wounded. When a municipal building was struck, the IDF said that they captured 4 Hezbollah militants and killed dozens of others. On Wednesday, it was reported that Lebanese hospitals are buckling because of the number of injured, also because of having actually experienced damage. They said that the UN has also warned of the targeting of help and relief operations. Over 90 rockets were fired on Israel from Lebanon on Wednesday. 3 men and women were lightly wounded in Israel. There also was a rare strike earlier this week that Israeli struck northern Lebanon, and 21 people were killed. This was unusual because it was so far north in Lebanon, and also it was a very Christian area. Zartat was the name of the area, and this is outside of Hezbollah's main areas of influence, Hezbollah has a tendency to operate in Lebanon south and east. And Netanyahu's response was, he said, "We will strike Hezbollah without mercy everywhere in Lebanon, including in Beirut." As of Tuesday, the death toll in Lebanon was 2,350 people killed since October 8th. And those killed since mid-September of this year is 1,740 people. The UN Human Rights Office said that it's received reports that 12 women and 2 children were among the 22 killed by the Israeli airstrike in a North Lebanese town called Aito. And UNICEF said that more than 400,000 children in Lebanon have been displaced in just the last 3 weeks. Hezbollah's deputy chief, Naim Qassem, said that the organization asked to cease fighting and that they will retreat to 10 kilometers in order to not provoke Israel, but that they demanded that there also be a ceasefire in Gaza. They said it is not possible to separate Lebanon from Palestine. He said that since Israel has attacked anywhere in Lebanon, we also have the right to attack anywhere in Israel. UN peacekeeping forces, this has been a big issue in South Lebanon. They said that 2 Israeli tanks forced their way into one of their positions. This group is called UNIFIL. They said that the IDF had requested that they turn out their lights, but then 2 hours later, they received rounds that were fired nearby their camp. 15 of their peacekeepers were wounded. On Friday, Israeli forces had fired at a watchtower that is used by the UN peacekeepers in South Lebanon. And the Lebanese Red Cross said on Monday that Israeli airstrikes in a northern Lebanese village, this is that village of Aito, where initially it was reported that 18 people were killed, and later that number increased. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said he spoke with Israeli counterparts, Gallant, to offer his condolences. There was an incident where a number of Israeli soldiers had been killed. And so Secretary of Defense Austin gave his condolences for the Israeli soldiers killed, and also stressed the importance of ensuring the safety of the UN UNIFIL forces as well. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected accusations that Israeli troops had deliberately targeted the UNIFIL peacekeepers in Lebanon, and he called for that mission specifically, to be withdrawn from combat regions. The UNIFIL spokesperson later confirmed that the mission is staying under a Security Council mandate. And the Pentagon did announce and confirm that THAAD had arrived in Israel with the U.S. military personnel required to operate it. Netanyahu told the U.S. that Israel will strike Iranian military, not nuclear or oil targets, according to officials. So there's been this big question of how Israel will counterattack Iran. There's been a question of when that will happen, if it will happen, to what degree it will happen. And so Israel has assured it will not attack nuclear or oil targets. On Friday, there was an attack on where Israel attacked central Beirut, killing 22 people. So this was last Friday, October 11th. One of the things that was unique about that attack on October 11th is that the IDF did not issue a warning, which they often do. The Lebanese government asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to call the UN Security Council to a vote, asking for an immediate and full ceasefire. And so one of the things that we're seeing happen is that the Lebanese government, to some degree, feels caught in the middle between this war between Hezbollah and Israel. Israel has said that they're opposed to a unilateral ceasefire in their war with Hezbollah. Netanyahu has been going to battle with Macron in France. And so the last couple of days, there's been a lot of rhetoric going back and forth between those two leaders. And the U.S. said yesterday that it opposed the scope of Israel's recent airstrikes in Beirut. The State Department said that they have expressed their concerns directly to Netanyahu. Top German leaders blocked weapons sales to Israel pending assurances that it would not use German weapons against civilian targets, a source told Politico. And I wanted to just close with a couple of updates from this past week that are kind of more general updates. According to The Intercept, over 4 days in Gaza, the Israeli military killed 2 journalists, severely injured at least 3 others. So this was when the evacuations began in North Gaza and intensified around the Jabalia refugee camp. They killed Mohammed al-Tanini, a cameraman for Al-Aqsa TV. His colleague Tamer Labad was injured. Fadi al-Wahidi was a cameraman for Al Jazeera Arabic, who was shot in the neck and, according to other journalists, is now permanently paralyzed. So according to The Intercept, they got reports from the media office in Gaza that 175 journalists have been killed since October 7th, not including the latest deaths in that regard. In addition, on October 13th, just a few days ago, it was the 1-year anniversary of the killing of Issam Abdallah, who was a Lebanese video journalist who worked for Reuters, who was killed by Israeli Defense Forces in tank fire in South Lebanon on October 13th, a year ago, while reporting on the context of the Israel-Hamas war. And one of the things that's important to note in that regard is that these escalations in South Lebanon and North Israel, while they have become much, much more intense in past weeks, that they have been going on since October, more than a year ago. A New York Times investigation found that Israeli troops in Gaza, this was reported on October 13th, have regularly forced captured Palestinians to act as human shields. According to the investigation, the IDF regularly forced captured Palestinians to carry out life-threatening reconnaissance missions to avoid putting Israeli soldiers at risk in the battlefield. While the extent of these operations is unknown, the Times reported that the practice has been used by at least 11 military squads in 5 different cities across Gaza. Also, the New York Times reported that secret documents have shown how Hamas tried to persuade Iran to join in their October 7th attacks. This was a significant report by the New York Times. They reviewed minutes from 10 different meetings of Hamas leaders. The document showed how Hamas's plans were far bigger than what actually happened on October 7th, including an attempt to have a September 11th style toppling of a skyscraper in Tel Aviv. That Hamas actually avoided escalations after 2021 to falsely imply that they had been deterred, all the while planning for a major attack. The document showed some of the things that we've discussed previously in these daily updates, that the decision for the attack on October 7th was also influenced by Hamas's desire to interrupt the normalization plans between Saudi Arabia and Israel. In addition, that the attack on October 7th sought to interrupt the entrenchment of Israeli occupation in the West Bank, and also to maintain control over the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on Haram al-Sharif. Finally, just an update from the US. You may be familiar with the names Josh Paul and Tariq Habash, both former Biden administration officials who quit over opposition to President Biden's policies via Gaza. They just announced that they have launched a new lobbying organization that's called A New Policy. And I wanted to let you know that they formed this organization, which is focused specifically on shifting the political economic incentives for elected officials on U.S. policy towards Palestine and Israel. One of their board members is the former ambassador, Robert Ford, who was an ambassador to Syria and Algeria. You might have also seen that the Nobel Peace Prize was given to a grassroots organization of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The organization is called Hibakusha. They received the Nobel Peace Prize for efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, for demonstrating through witness testimony that nuclear weapons must never be used again. When the prize was announced, the co-chair, Nihon Hidankyo, spoke to reporters in Tokyo and said, "In Gaza, bleeding children are being held by their parents, and it's just like it was in Japan 80 years ago." And one of the things that the winners said when they received the prize is they said, "I thought that those fighting hard for peace in Gaza would deserve it." The Japanese anti-nuclear campaigner whose group won the Nobel Prize said that he was surprised that they won the award instead of people working to stop Israel's war on Gaza. And I just thought Art Laffin was the one that highlighted that to me, which I thought was really profound. And one of the things that's been articulated about that in terms of the Nobel Prize is that normally those quotes and those stories are all over the press, and that it's been asserted that because of advocacy towards Gaza, that story has not been told as widely as it might otherwise have been shared. Well, I'm grateful to be with you all. I've missed you. Gratitude to Ben for facilitating the last few weeks. And I will look forward to being with you next week. And the Lord willing, we'll have steps in the right direction. So may God be with you until we're together again. Blessings.